Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Digging up the executed French dictator, Robespierre. The remains of one of the most brutal and barbaric men in French history may be seen by thousands each day, but they may not know who they are looking at. One of the most shocking and infamous men of the French Revolution was Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Terror. He was the man who was responsible for the horror which came following the revolution, with terror being the importance of the day. This led to thousands of people being led to the guillotine. Many of these people who were condemned and were executed were everyday people who were suspected of harbouring resentment towards the revolution. But Robespierre would crack down on them and would show little remorse, and quickly he rose to become the most powerful man inside of France. But he too, like the king and queen who came before him, would meet his maker on the guillotine inside of Paris, at the same place as Louis and Marie Antoinette. But following his execution, his remains went on a strange journey, where today they rest in a place along with thousands others. Or do they? Robespierre was the president of the National Convention for a short period, but he was most influential in his position as a member of the Committee of Public Safety. But as mentioned, many across France believed he was the incarnation of the terror himself, and he would champion executions of the public to ensure that everyone fell into line with the revolution. But as time went on, he flew too close to the sun, and he would then be accused of being too strong. At the time, there was a huge threat in France of foreign invasion, and many were angry with the fact the king and queen were executed. Robespierre then called for a stronger action, and the terror would be ramped up. There were accounts of women who witnessed their husbands losing their heads on the guillotine, but when the wives would cry for their executed husband, they would then be dragged to the guillotine themselves. Robespierre was acting like a dictator, and he asked the National Convention to bring in a new religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. But because of the terror, he became a figure of hatred, and the people of France had executed the king, their previous figure of hatred. But Robespierre would be arrested, and within a day he would be dead. Rebels had conspired against him, but he was then condemned to death, and was then executed. One witness said of the execution that, at 4 p.m, the sinister procession moved out of the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such a size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people. Spectators, men and women of all ages filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was universal jubilation, coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with doubled force. Everyone applauded wildly, and seemed to be sorry they could not do more. Most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, Caution, and Henri were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigands the gendarmes had surprised in the forest, and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty, blood-stained linen. His features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it even more repulsive. He kept his eyes downward and almost closed, whether that was from the pain of his wounds or an awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. Just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart, carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster spewed from hell, the thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked at her sadly as she said, "Go now, evildoer, go down into your grave carrying the curses of the wives and mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him out prone until it was his turn for execution. While his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared not to be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried up the scaffold. Some said that when he saw the instrument of death, he heaved a sigh of pain, but before dying he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, the executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which the surgeon had put on his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at least it was severed from his body and the executioner held it up by the hair to show the people, it presented an indescribable horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal that nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the Commune or their outlawed accomplices. Following Robespierre losing his head on the guillotine, Madame Tussaud would craft a death mask and a head of Robespierre. She had done this with the French Queen, and she moulded the head at the foot of the guillotine following the blade falling on Robespierre. There were efforts after his execution to stop people gaining access to Robespierre's corpse, but his remains were then, following this, dumped inside of a mass grave at the Arancis cemetery. This was where many people executed during the French Revolution were buried and left. Inside of, however, at one point, Robespierre's remains were moved from here. The cemetery, during the French Revolution and others, quickly filled up, and many of the bodies inside of these cemeteries were in such a bad state of decomposition that when the mass graves were dug up, the identities could not be worked out. King Louis XVIII would try looking for his sister, but the skeletal remains of many people, including Robespierre buried inside of the Arancis cemetery, were then moved to the catacombs of Paris. These underground ossuaries in Paris hold the remains of more than 6 million people, and this meant that Robespierre's remains have been almost lost to time, and they are probably inside of the catacombs, but are lost and not identified. However, what is interesting is that recent research has been uncovered that the bones found in the walls of a chapel in Paris may contain the remains of Robespierre and other prominent revolutionaries. This chapel has a number of ossuaries which contain a number of boxes, which are covered in leather and are filled with the remains of people who were executed. But it's possible that Robespierre's remains may be here, or may still be inside of the catacombs, meaning that people each day may be walking past when they visit the underground graveyard. But Robespierre was the most brutal and barbaric figure of the French Revolution, and his time in power resulted in the executions of thousands of people inside of France. He was a man who met his downfall in a shootout, but those who witnessed him being executed on the guillotine saw another and powerful figure condemned that day. It was a time in the land which was filled with uncertainty and shock, and because of this, France took many decades to recover, but Robespierre's remains today are known to either be in the catacombs or they are somewhere else. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.